Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Megillah. We'll be learning in today's Shir Mitzvah Hashem Daf Kuf Nun Ches Amid Aleph. We pick up on Kuf Nun Zayin Amid Beis, Siman Taf Reish Tzadik Aleph, Sif Gimel, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 lines off the bottom of the Shulchan Aruch. Even though we have a considerable amount of Shulchan Aruch to cover in today's Shir, we don't have a lot of Mishnah Berurah. I have a funny feeling it will be a little bit of an abbreviated share, which might be a good thing. Maybe it'll give my voice a little time to recuperate. Okay, let's get going. So Sif Gimel says the Shulchan Aruch, aseres bnei Haman, when we write the 10 sons of Haman in the Megillah, tzarich lekasva kishira. It has to be written in the format of a shira. We have several different shiros in the Torah HaKadoshah, in the Torah itself, as well as in Navi. So, prime example would be Az Yashir. Az Yashir, of course, is a shira, and the shira is written in the Sefer Torah in a different style than the rest of the Sefer Torah. The rest of the Sefer Torah is written in columns, and the writing is written continuous, unless we come to a stuma or a psucha, where there's a gap between the parshios. When we come to a shira like Az Yashir, it is actually written like brickwork. You have a phrase, and then in the line below you have a phrase in the center, and then in the next line, again, 2 phrases, one on each side of the column, blank in the middle, then on the next line, a phrase in the center. That's the way a shira is generally written. Now, the aseres bnei Haman has to be written in the style of a shira, but the Mechaber says not precisely in the style of the shira, not the way I just described to you. The way I described it to you, that's the way the shiras in the Torah are written. This is written slightly differently. So again, aseres bnei Haman tzarich lekasva kishira, you have to write it in the style of a shira. However, v'loi kisha'ar shiros, not like the rest of the shiros, shechalok al gabe ksav, where you have open blank space on top of what's written. Again, if you have something, I should have come a little bit better prepared for this. So let's quickly grab a paper. And I hit a button. That's never good. Okay, everything is continuing to work. Okay. All you got to do is hit the wrong button on the keyboard and everything goes awry. Let's see. Let's get a blank page. Okay. This would be the style of the writing of a typical shira. The boxes over here would have writing in them. So these would each be phrases. And as you can see, this is chalok al gabe haksav. There's blank space, there's blank klaf on top of the writing on every line. So when you have a phrase over here, it's blank up here. You have a phrase over here in the center, it's blank up here. So that's the typical style of a shira, chalok al gabe ksav. That's not the way the aseres bnei Haman are written. Rather, elamania chalok ben ksav l'ksav. The way the aseres bnei Haman are written is that you have chalok, you have open space between the writing. So here you have my Megillah, and as you can see, you have the aseres bnei Haman, and you have blank klaf between the names of the aseres bnei Haman and the word ve'es. So it's written as a shira in that it's not written in continuous lines. It has gaps, but it's not done like brickwork. It's just done in 2 columns. The name is on one side and ve'es on the other side. Continues the Mechaber, and he says, ve'im loy asakain, if you did not do this, if you did not write the aseres bnei Haman in the format of a shira, psula, then the Megillah would be puzzled. Now, why is it so important that the aseres bnei Haman be written as a shira? I believe it's based on the pasuk, ba'avoid rishaim rina. with the destruction of Rishaim comes Rina, comes great rejoicing. So, when we write about the demise of the aseres bnei Haman, that is a shira. It's a song. It's something that we rejoice over. Okay, Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Yud Zayin, Maniach Chalak. So we leave empty space between the name and the ace. How much empty space do you have to leave? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kiflayim min haksav. The empty space has to be double the writing. So let's say you have the first one of the aseres bnei Haman is parmashta. So on one side it's going to say parmashta. Then at the end of that line it's going to say the ace. So you need double parmashta and double the ace. So the blank area between parmashta and the ace would have to be big enough to have parmashta, the ace, the ace. Okay. Now we go to Sif Dalet, 3 lines off the bottom. Tzarich laha'arich bevav devaizasa. We have to lengthen the vav in vaizasa. Vaizasa is the last one of the aseres bnei Haman, and we have to lengthen the vav. What does this mean, to lengthen the vav? So says the Ramah, biksivasa. When we write it, we have to lengthen it. We still don't know exactly what that means, but the Ramah says right away, v'yesh omrim bikriyasa. And some say that no, it's not that when we write it, we have to lengthen it. When we read it, we have to lengthen it. Okay, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah here. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Yud Ches. Laha'arich bevav de vaizasa. We have to lengthen the vav of vaizasa. Says the Chavetz Chaim, this means limtayach roisha hakafuf, to stretch the horizontal head of the vav. We all know what a vav looks like. I don't have to draw it for you. It's got a little bit of a horizontal roish, and then it's got the leg, the stick going down. Says the Chavetz Chaim, what does this mean? And he brings this down from the Ran. It means that you take the horizontal roof of the vav and you slant it somewhat up. You can't make it vertical. The vav can't be a straight line. It has to have a gag. But normally the gag is very much horizontal. It's a right angle. The roish of the vav and the leg of the vav form a right angle. What we do is we're supposed to tilt the roish of the vav so it is somewhat pointing up. That's the shita of the Ran. Limtayach roisha hakafuf. We should stretch out the horizontal head of the vav. V'tihiyeh ke'ein zekufa. So it should be like it's standing up a little bit. Why do we do this? Says the Chavetz Chaim. L'rames, to give a remez, shenislu kulam b'zekifa achas. That all of the aseres bnei Haman were hung at one time on one long, tall, horizontal tree. So we want to emphasize the height and the length of the vav. Okay, now let's go to Ois Katan Yud Tes. The Ramah said, some say that it's not in the writing of the vav that we have to lengthen it, it's in the kriya. What does that mean? Says the Chavetz Chaim, Shalo yachtoif oisa. We should not chap the vav. So we shouldn't read it vaizasa. If I read it vaizasa, you could barely hear the vav. Instead, you should read it vaizasa. You should put a little bit of an emphasis on that vav, vaizasa. Vaizasa. So you spend a little extra time on the reading of the vav. So far what we have over here is 2 shitas. We have one shita that lengthening the vav means in how we write the vav. And the Chavetz Chaim told us it means that we should tilt the roish of the vav upwards. The Ramah brings down that there's another shita that you should emphasize the pronunciation, the enunciation of the vav. You should spend more time on it. That's what it means to lengthen the vav. Vaizasa. Spend more time on the vav. Now let's take a look here at the Sharit Tzion, Ois Katan Yud Dalet. You see, if you take a look at my Megillah, we don't really stretch out. I don't know if you can see the bottom over there, Vaizasa. We don't really tilt the roish of the vav up. That's not what we do. So it says, and this is a prime example of the Chavetz Chaim being machriya the halacha in the Sharet Tzion, as opposed to in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Sharet Tzion, this idea that you should slant the Rosh of the Vav upwards, he brings from the Ran. V'huva b'Taz, and the Ran is quoted by the Taz. But, says the Chavetz Chaim, v'achshav lo'inagu kach, nowadays we are not noyig to do that, says the Chavetz Chaim. Ella, rather, what do? Kedas ha'oimrim sheyeh havav gedola. We make the Vav very big. That's what we do. V'hi me alpha besa shel oisiyos gedolos. And the fact that this Vav should be written big is given to us in the Mesorah of all of the letters of the Aleph Beis that are supposed to be written large in Tanakh. This Vav is one of them that's brought down. So that's what we do. So at the end of this Sif, it turns out we have really, I think, three different opinions. One opinion is we lengthen the Vav by writing it and the way we do that is we tilt the Rosh of the Vav up. Another opinion, we lengthen the Vav, pshutai k'mashmai. We lengthen it. We make it very long. We make it bigger. Third opinion, we enunciate it for a longer amount of time. We put an emphasis on the Vav. Okay. Now we go second line from the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch, last word. V'tzarech lichtov ish b'rosh dapa. The word ish has to appear at the top of the column. So again, if you take a look at my Megillah, you'll see the word ish, very prominent over there. The first word on the Amid is ish. Now, I'm just going to point out to you while I'm holding the Megillah that if you look at the column of the ace, all the way at the bottom, you'll see the word aseres. Okay? So we have two columns. The first column starts with ish. The second column ends with aseres. What does the Mechaber say? V'tzarech lichtov ish b'rosh tapa. We have to write ish at the top of the column, which we just saw. The ace b'soifa. And the word ace has to appear at the end. Now, literally translated, this would mean at the end of the column. But I just showed you the word aseres at the end of the column, not the ace. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the ace b'soifa, pirish b'soifa shita. You have to say that when he says that the ace should come at the end, he means at the end of the line, not at the end of the column. Aval b'soifa daf, at the bottom of the column, yichtov tevas aseres, you have to write the word aseres. Okay, continues the Mishnah Berurah Kuftul Chesam and Aleph. Ubediyevet. Im loy herech bevav de vaizasa. If you did not lengthen the vav of vaizasa, v'chein im kasav akar tevas aseres oichitais, or if after you wrote the word aseres, it was not the last word on that column of the Megillah. So if you saw in my Megillah, the aseres bnei Haman takes up a whole page. If you did not end the page with aseres, but the line ended with aseres, and then you continued writing the Megillah, you wrote more lines, then says the Mishnah Berurah, kosher, it is kosher. However, v'yesh machmirin, there are those that are machmir kishakasav akatevas aseres oichitais. There are those that are machmir and say that after the word aseres, you cannot continue writing any additional lines. V'ayin b'shar Ephraim Siman Sifnun Dalid. Kasav de Miesha Megillah Acheres Ksuva Kedina. If you have another Megillah that's properly written, Ein Likreis Bazula Chatchila B'tzibur. You should not use a Megillah that has additional lines after Aseres B'tzibur. Unless there's going to be a Tircha de Tzibura while you wait to go get another Megillah, then Yechayim Likreis Bazu, then you could use this Megillah. For those who can, there's a very interesting Sharet Tzion Ois Katan Tez Zayin on Kufta Zayin Amud Beis that I'm not going to go into right now, that goes a little deeper into this sugya. This is actually a rather complicated sugya. You saw in my Megillah that the aseres bnei Haman takes up a whole page. Now, that's only 11 lines. My Megillah is not an 11-line Megillah. My Megillah, I believe, is a 26 or 27. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. It's a 28-line Megillah. But the aseres bnei Haman, that column, that limud of the Megillah, is only 11 lines. All of the wording of the aseres bnei Haman are written much larger than the rest of the Megillah. Now, I read to you from Sharetzion Ois Katan Yudalid about this Alpha Besa Shel Oisiyos Gedolos. We actually have a Mesorah, which letters are supposed to be written large. Now, the Vav of Vaizasa is in that Mesorah, but the other letters of the aseres bnei Haman are not in that Mesorah. And therefore, there are those that hold that you can't write a Megillah this way. You can't have a whole Megillah that's written 28 lines so that each letter is, let's say, this big, and then have one amud where you only have 11 lines and each letter is that big, because that means that you wrote all of those letters bigger than the rest of the Megillah, and that's not part of the Mesorah. And that, by the way, is what gave rise to the minig of writing an 11-line Megillah. The reason there's such a bria as an 11-line Megillah is because that allows you to write the aseres bnei Haman all alone on one amud and keep all of the lettering, except for the Vav of Vaizasa, the same size as the rest of the Megillah. So this is actually a rather complex sugya. Okay, weiter. Bottom line of Kufta Zainam and Beis in the Mechaber. Sifhei. Im Tifara Bechute Pishtan Pesula. As you can see, the Megillah is constructed of many, many different pieces of cloth, and you can see the seam there in the center, and they are sewn together. What do you sew it together with? We're supposed to use gidin, sinews. It says the Mechaber Im Tifara Bechute Pishtan. If you use flax, you use some kind of thread, psula, the Megillah is puzzle. This is based on the halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai by tefillin. Tefillin have to be sewn with the gidin of a kosher animal. And we learn out from the halacha of tefillin, we learn to a Sefer Torah, that a Sefer Torah also has to be sewn together using the gidin of a kosher animal. And since the Megillah is called a Sefer, if you remember, I think it was yesterday, we pointed out that the Megillah in one pasuk is called an Igeres, in one pasuk is called a Sefer. V'nechtav b'Sefer. So it is called a Sefer, and therefore in the preparation and the writing of the Megillah, the construction of the Megillah, it has the dinim of a Sefer Torah. So it also has to be sewn together using gidin. Sivav. Im hitel ba. Now this is very critical. The first word of this sif is im, if. Im hitel ba shloisha chute gidim kishera. If the way you sewed the Megillah together was you used three gidin. So you didn't, you see, on my Megillah, I don't think you're going to be able to see it. I don't think it's going to show up in the camera. See, the entire seam is sewn together using one long piece of gidin, and there's a stitch here, a stitch here, a stitch here, a stitch here, but it goes in and out, in and out, in and out, and it goes from almost all the way near the bottom to almost all the way near the top. So the entire seam is sewn closed using one length of gidin. Says the Mechaber, Im hitel ba shloisha chute gidim. If you didn't do that, if you used one section of gidin on top, and one somewhere in the middle, and one somewhere near the bottom. So you took three different pieces of gidin, and you made, let's say, 3 stitches. It's kosher. Ubelvad sheyu mishulashos. But it has to be mishulish. It has to be done in thirds. What does that mean? Says the Mechaber, umipnei sheyesh by pirushim shainim. Since there are various explanations given by the Rishonim, what it means that it has to be mishulish, tzarich lotzei sidei kulam, we have to see to it to do it in such a way to be yoitza all of the shitas. Let's take a look right away at the Bir Halacha, Dibur HaMaschil, Umipnei Sheyesh by Pirushim Shainim. And the Chavetz Chaim in this Biur Halacha brings down 3 different shittas of how the seams should be sewn closed. The Rashi Pirish, Rashi learns, Shemechalik la'arba chalakim es oirech hayiriyah. What you do is, you take the seam of the Megillah, and you have to divide it into even quarters. Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4. So you have 4 quarters. You divide it into 4 quarters. V'yeh tfira achas lamayla b'soif rivia. Then you have to put in 1 stitch at the bottom of the first quarter. So you put 1 stitch over there. Vashnia, and the second stitch goes b'soif chetzia, at the halfway mark, at the center. So according to Rashi, you have 1 stitch at the bottom of the first quarter. You have a second stitch at the center. And then the third one goes v'ashlishis betchilas haravia shal tzad mata, at the top of the bottom quarter. So again, how did the Mechaber start here? The Mechaber said we're talking about a case where you're using 3 gidim. You're using 3 pieces of gidim, and you're making 3 stitches. Where should those 3 stitches go? What's called mishulish? So Rashi says, divide the seam into even quarters. The top stitch has to go at the bottom of the top quarter. The second stitch goes at the center point. The third stitch goes at the top of the bottom quarter. That's Shitas Rashi. Next, V'arif Pirish, the Rif says, Mishulashin Kipshutai. Mishulish means very simple. Shnayim, you have 2 stitches, B'shnei Roshei HaYariyah, at the 2 ends of the Yariyah. So 1 stitch up here, 1 stitch down here, and then V'achas Ben Samamish, and 1 at the center. So the Rif says, you know what Mishulish is? Very simple. 3 even stitches. 1 at the top, 1 at the center, 1 at the bottom. That's the Rif. And then finally, we have the Rambam. For Rambam Mefarish, the Rambam says, what does Mishulashin mean? Shalosh Tvirais Beroish HaYariyah. You need 3 stitches at the top. V'shalosh B'saifa, and 3 stitches at the bottom. V'shalosh B'mtziisa, and 3 in the middle. Okay, so what do you have now? What you have now is like this. According to the Rif, 1 at the top, 1 at the bottom, 1 at the middle. According to the Rambam, 3 at the top, 3 at the bottom, 3 in the middle. So let's take care of the Rif right now. We could easily be Yaitza the Rambam and the Rif. Do the Rambam. 3 at the top, 3 at the bottom, 3 in the middle. Once you do that, you're definitely Yaitza the Rif. The Rif was 1 at the top, 1 at the bottom, 1 at the middle. If you did 3 at the top, 3 at the bottom, and 3 at the middle, you were Yaitza the Rambam and the Rif. What are you missing? You're missing Rashi. What did Rashi say? Rashi said 1 at the bottom of the top quarter. Well, if you do 3 at the top, you weren't Mekayim Rashi, because that's 3 at the top. You didn't necessarily reach the bottom of the top quarter. Then Rashi said 1 at the center. Well, the 1 at the center, you yaitza with the 3 at the center of the Rambam. Then you need 1 at the top of the bottom quarter. You didn't necessarily be yaitza that with the Rambam, because the Rambam said 3 at the bottom. I don't know that you got the top of the bottom quarter. So what's the yaitza? The yaitza is do the Rambam, 3 at the top, 3 at the middle, 3 at the bottom. You yaitza the Rambam in the Rif. You're also yaitza Rashi's 1 stitch at the center, because you have 3 at the middle. Now you just have to add 1 stitch at the bottom of the top quarter and 1 stitch at the top of the bottom quarter. And now you yaitza all 3 shitas, Rashi, the Rif, and the Rambam. And that's precisely what the Mechaber tells you to do. The Mechaber says, let's go back to the top line. Since we have a lot of different explanations here, we saw 3 shitas. We have to be yaitza all of them. How do you do that? You do the Rambam. You did 3 at the top, 3 at the bottom, and 3 at the middle. That's the Rambam. And by doing that, you yaitza the Rambam and the Rif. And you add 1 stitch at the quarter mark on one side, and another single stitch at the quarter mark on the other side to be Yotza Rashi. So presto, you are Yotza all of the Shitas. Says the Mishnah Berurah is Katlachaf Aleph. Barosha, when the Mechaber talks about the top, realize shall call Uriah v'Uriah. He's talking about by every seam. You need to do this by every seam throughout the Megillah. V'ayin b'chayodim shekasav, take a look at chayodim. It writes, Dim tefura kula begin. If you do what my Megillah has, and what we're going to see is supposed to do lechatchila, which is you stitch the entire seam with gidin, then ein tzarich l'dakti kama tfiris. It doesn't matter how many stitches you have. My Megillah happens to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That seam has 7. I wonder if they're all the same even. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, it looks like they're all 7. Yeah, they all seem to be 7. But if the whole seam is stitched, we're not makbid how many stitches there are. Rashi, we have to divide it into even quarters. Okay, now let's go to the Ramah. 3 lines down. If you don't have more gidin. So, what the Ramah seems to be saying is like this. I pointed out to you that Siv Vav starts with the word im. This whole discussion of Rashi, the Rif, and the Rambam was an if. If you're only going to stitch the Megillah a minimal amount of times, then you have to make sure it's Meshulish. And in order for it to be Meshulish, we have 3 Shitas in the Rishonim. So you have to do it in such a way to be Mekayim all the Rishonim. But Lechatchila, you should really stitch the whole thing. Based on that, says the Ramah here, if you did this Eitzah of the Mechaber to be Yotza all of the Rishonim, but you did not have enough Gidin to taka stitch the entire seam, im Eila Gidin Yoser, Mutav Litvar Adishar Bechute Pishtan, it would be better that you should stitch the rest of it using flax. Milahanichai Beloy Tvira. So the Ramah is telling you very clearly, really, we want you to stitch the entire seam. If you did the Mechaber's minimal Eitzah, now take Pishtan and sew up the rest. Avalim Yeshla Gidin, but if you have Gidin, Yitvar Kula Begidin. You should sew the entire seam using Gidin. Vatfira Tiyami Bachutz, the stitches should be on the outside, like you see over here. The stitches are on the outside of the Megillah. On the inside of the Megillah, you can see that there's a seam. Where is it? You can see that there's a seam right there next to the aseres bnei Haman, but you can't see any stitches. So the stitching is done on the outside, v'loy mimifnim, not on the inside. Okay, says Zayin. Tzarech la'aniach shiur b'roish ha'yariya u'b'soifa kishetayf from yachad. You have to leave a little space at the top and the bottom of the seam. You don't stitch, trying to show you here, I can open up the seam a little bit at the top. My camera is not focusing on it. Okay, there it is. I can open the seam a little bit at the top because the stitching starts about a half an inch or an inch down. That's where the stitching starts. You have to leave space at the top and at the bottom. That's also halakha that's learned out from a Sefer Torah. The reason for it is because it says in the Gemara, if you would stitch the seam completely from top to bottom, if somebody would pull it too tight, they could rip it. But if you leave a little give at the top and the bottom, then if somebody pulls it tight, he'll see it start to spread apart where it's not stitched, and he'll release the tension. He'll realize he's pulling it too tight. And the end of Seif Zayin, u'b'mashu husagi. All you have to leave is a tiny bit. There's no minimum shear. Sif Ches. Ein kairin b'tzibur. We do not lay in the Megillah in a tzibur. A tzibur means a minion of 10. B'Megillah haksuva bein haksuvim. Let's say you have a klaf that is chamesh megillas. You have one ksaf that has in it Shirashirim, Kaheles, Eicha, Rus, Esther. You have everything. Chamesh megillas, all in one klaf. You're not allowed to lay megillas Esther from that klaf, b'tzibur. V'im kara, and if you did, lo yotza, you're not yotza. Elim kein hoisa yisera al shar hayiriyos oy chasera. Unless the klaf, the section that has Megillas Esther, is either taller or shorter than the rest of the klaf. What's the reason for this halacha? Let's take a look right away at the Mishnah Berurah's Kotlich of Gimel. Bein Aksuvim. Atam, the reason for this is the lo yehevi presume nisa. If you're laning from a chamesh Megillas, that takes away from the presume nisa of Megillas Esther. Demase kikar b'mikra. It looks like you're laning stam from Tanakh. Mishum hachi b'yachid kosher. And that's why this is a problem b'tzibur, but not b'yechidus. Why? Because if you're laning b'yechidus, the balav hachi like a presume. If you're laning b'yechidus, you don't have presume nisa anyway. Since the whole problem is a lack of presume nisa, b'yechidus anyway, you don't have presume nisa. V'chol be'asara mikri tzibur. Once you have a need of 10, that's called a tzibur, where you would not be able to use such a klaf. It's okay if the section of klaf that the Megillah is written on is yisera, if it's taller, or it's chesera, or it's shorter. What does this mean? It's longer than the rest of the klaf, lamayla oy lamata, either going upwards or going downwards, oy chesera, or it's shorter. So that now that section, the Megillas Esther section of the klaf, has a heker. Continues the Mechaber, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines off of the bottom. We can't use such a chamesh Megillas klaf b'tzibur, aval a yachid karabite, but a yachid could use it. Va'afilu einach asera yisera, even if it's not shorter or taller. The yaitza b'yidei chavasai, and it can be yaitza the chiv. V'dafka kishik suva begilyain kisefer Torah, but it does have to be a scroll like a sefer Torah. Siftes. Megillah shehi nekuda. Let's say you have a Megillah that has vowels in it. It has the nekudos written into the Megillah. V'chein im kasav b'daf harishayin brachos upiyutim. Or let's say you started off the Megillah, you very beautifully wrote into the Megillah the brachos of Megillah. Why should the Balkar have to look for a sitter? Let him have it right there in the Megillah. Eino nifselis b'kach. It's not lechatchila, but the Megillah is not puzzle. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Kafei, shehi nekuda. If you have a Megillah that has nekudos, says the Mishnah Berurah, this is certainly not lechatchila. If you don't have anybody who's capable of reading the Megillah properly without nekudos, not the nekudos, b'ta'amim, the trup. If you don't have anybody who could lay in the Megillah properly with the trup, you could put the trup into the Megillah, and you can make a bracha. The trup is not any worse than the nekudos. And the Mechaber says, b'diavad, you could have the nekudos. So b'diavad, you could also have the trup. On the other hand, let's say you don't have anybody who could lay in the Megillah with the trup, and you don't have the trup in the Megillah. You could lay it without the trup. Like we learned earlier in Hilchos HaTorah, b'nei to Kriyas HaTorah. The brachas, you could write the brachas in the beginning of the Megillah, but lechatchila you're not allowed to do this. Lechatchila, you should not put the brachas into the Megillah. Now, by a sefer Torah, you're not allowed to have any of this. You can't have the nekudas, you can't have the trup, you can't have anything else written in there. We have a klara raya from the Gemara that you're not allowed to have the brachas written into the sefer Torah, because the Gemara in brachas, I think, Gemara in Megillah. The Gemara in Megillah says that the oila is supposed to go up to the sefer Torah. He's supposed to look at the place, right? Then he's supposed to look at the brachas and read the brachas. Clearly, the brachas are not inside the sefer. So you're not allowed to write the brachas in the sefer. The reason you're not allowed to write the brachas in the sefer is because somebody is going to say that it's a chelik of the Torah, and it's not. So you can't add anything into the Torah. But the Megillah, b'diavad, you could, and we saw that earlier, that we don't have to be so medactic on the Megillah if there are missing words, or missing letters, or extra letters. It's all right, so you have extra letters. But certainly not lechatchila. Sif Yud. Im ein Megillah kshera, if you don't have a kosher Megillah, kaira ma'isa b'chumish b'loi bracha. You learn from a chumish, albeit without a bracha. Now this chumish does not mean one of our art scroll chumashim. That's not what it means. It means a klaf that was written, but not with all of the halachas of a Sefer Torah in the Megillah. But it's written as a scroll. It's written as a klaf. Says the Mishnah Berurah, b'chumish, v'davka k'sha'asi ha'chumish b'galila. It has to be a scroll. K'masha kasa simikov b'em gimel. There are shittas that say that you could be yaitza with such a chumash b'shas chak. Ava b'chumash shalanu, but with one of our printed, bound shul chumashim, no. L'kulayama lo yatza, you're not yaitza. V'ar prima gadim kasav. However, the prima gadim does write the roi gam bazel likreis b'loi bracha, that in a shas chak you should even use a shul chumash without a bracha. Why? Shaloi tishtakach teres Megillah, so that the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah should not be forgotten. And the truth is, we saw a precedent for this in the halachas of Arba Minim. We saw by Arba Minim, if you don't have a kosher esrig, nobody has a kosher esrig in the whole tzibur, so you take an esrig that's puzzle, and you take the dal minim without a bracha. If you don't have all of the minim, you take what you have without a bracha. Why? Shaloi tishtakach teras Arba Minim, so that it shouldn't be forgotten. Okay. Finally, Sif Yod Aleph. Im kara b'Megillah gezula. If somebody read the Megillah from a stolen Megillah, Yotza, you are Yotza. Says the Mishnah Berurah Chav Ches. Yotza, why? Dein gezel b'koil. Because the Megillah is not the mitzvah. It's hearing the Megillah. That's koil. The koil is not stolen. You need a Megillah in order to lane, but that's not the ikr mitzvah. The mitzvah is hearing the Megillah. It's like shofar. We said by a stolen shofar. You could be yaitza if somebody blows with a stolen shofar. Why? Because you're listening to the koil. That's the mitzvah of shofar. You need a shofar to be able to produce a koil. But you're not being yaitza the mitzvah using a stolen chayfetz. Finally, says the Ramah Hagah, v'im mevarchim aleh. However, do you make a bracha on Mikra Megillah from a stolen Megillah? Ayla el sibitafresh ben tes. He says this back to Hilchos Arba Minim, le'inyan lulav haposel. Now, the Mishnah Berurah right away corrects this and says it should say le'inyan lulav hagozel. V'uadin kan. Now, a lulav hagozel, you don't make a bracha. You can't be yotze the mitzvah with a lulav hagozel. Again, you could be yotze with a stolen Megillah because you're being yotze the mitzvah with the koil, not with the Megillah. You could be yaitza with a stolen shofar because you're being yaitza with the koil of the shofar. Not so by Arba Minim. By Arba Minim, the lulav is a chefza shel mitzvah. So you can't be yaitza with a stolen lulav. But there are times that you could be yaitza with a lulav that was stolen. If somebody stole a lulav and then he made a shinui maisa, he made a significant change to the lulav, now he's kind of the lulav with Shida Maisa, Shida Rishus, he's kind of the lulav. So he has a lulav that was stolen that you now could be Yotze the mitzvah with, but you don't make a bracha. Because Baitzea Berech Ni'etzes Hashem. Somebody who stole and now he makes a bracha, that's a disgrace. You don't make a bracha on something that you stole. So too over here, you wouldn't make a bracha on a stolen Megillah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois got chavtes li lulav apostle, tzarich leimer li lulav agazel. Ois got lamen, v'adid kan, v'ayid b'prima godim, ta'afilu kedoi b'shina ma'isa v'chadayma, afilu hachi lai yavarich. Okay? Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Schus of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua's refuahs parnasa and shidduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the B'Yisrael Tzedek, b'meherav yameinu amen. Be well.